volunteering or helping with anything here?
No, I was like, I'm not going to volunteer. Well, while I there's just like,
There's that.
No, this is free.
Try
F11.
It's Chrome.
Yeah, Chrome is F11.
No.
You should mirror the stage and
I need the speaker notes because we're doing. I'm actually okay. I'm actually okay with this. Oh right, I see it. Hey!
yay.
All right.
T2 and then. Your second? Yeah. Up and then. Okay.
I just had the weirdest setup, so I wanted to go first. I hope you guys don't mind me jumping on there. Of course, Mohini's not around.
So I'm going to be here with the cards.
I lost the speaker notes somehow.
Maybe they lost you.
Alright, we'll start over. Close.
I mean, it's sort of.
I just came from a different talk too, so it was in the 805.
Yeah.
Where's the volume control?
Here. No, up here.
This is like.
Maybe I should.
It's because it's through HDMI. I have to go through the HDMI restaurant.
Yeah, so you press Command click on the little icon.
So, but I can't do internal speakers going because we don't have an 8-inch phone jack.
Yeah, so you're going through the
Restaurant. Yeah, so I have to go through HDMI, which doesn't allow you to change the volume is HDMI.
Right, but then you need
Right, right.
Something good. We're trying to set up the volume to Skype Mohini and make it louder. Or just get it set up. Yeah.
We're still setting up, just getting people to Skype in. We're starting in just a second.
So for example, like
Hello?
Hey, you're on. Everybody can hear you.
Awesome. I can't see or hear anyone.
So the first, Mohini is joining us from Bombay, as usual. If you've seen her talk recently, she's been Skyping in from different places in the world that she's been at for a variety of reasons I'm not going to go into right now. This is. Do you want to do a general introduction before I'm a teacher, so I just like talk.
Alright. Welcome everyone. To begin, we have Mohini, Dutta, and Ben Norskov. And I'll pass it over to them to introduce themselves.
So thanks everybody for coming. I am Ben, and Mohini and I run a small games consultancy called Antidote Games, and I also teach part-time at Parsons School for Design. So I'll let Mohini also introduce herself.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon from Bombay. I think it's 12:30 right now. But I'm really glad to be able to speak with you, and I'm super sad to miss another year of different games. But hopefully we can fix that next year. A little bit about myself. I'm a game designer, and I also talk about sort of the intersection between games and culture a lot. And we'll be discussing the way we make games at Ben and my studio, Antidote Games, where we work mostly with real-world issues and games aimed at non-gamers. Thank you.
So just to begin, it's sort of like, how do we game, right? So we're going to go in.
Right. So, I'm sorry. There's going to be a little bit of confusion here because I have no idea what's going on there. So just bear with us.
We've tried this is the first time we're doing co-presenting versus like one at a time. And normally she has some sort of video, but like because of the connection's slow. Anyways, very sorry. Stay with us. Hopefully it'll be worth it.
Thank you, Ben. So anyway, I wanted to start by paraphrasing Jasper Ewell because why not? So according to Jasper, games are the products of interaction within a set of rules, either implied or clearly represented within a mutable system. You should be able to see Huizinga reading a book very soulfully right now, but what I wanted to mostly say about that was that Huizinga starts his book about the nature of human beings in play, Homo ludens, by telling us that we, like all animals, play. We learn about life through play, so it is reasonable to say that our play, and by relation our games, are the products of our lives. Our identities are the products of our culture and society, which are subjective to the area, affluence, education, and various other subjective factors we experience. Anyone who has traveled or met a foreigner will know only too well how markedly different life experiences can be from region to region. So it seems reasonable to me to suggest that our play culture is as varied and as diverse as we are. I'll pass it on to you, Ben.
So, I mean, games have started sort of a universal art form. There really isn't any ancient culture that doesn't have some sort of game and play within it. And the concentration of games as sort of a Western medium happened because basically Westerners had computers first, and there's really nothing that humans haven't tried to play with. And so I don't think it's when anybody had a computer, they're going to obviously play with it. I saw a wonderful talk earlier today about games in the Czech Republic and how people were playing with computers that they had then. So because we had computers first in the West, we started making video games first. And I don't think it's unusual. Any other culture would have done the same. So modern games...
Right. Modern games, much like mass media in general, were a Western monopoly, like Ben was just talking about. And until very recently, given the politics of access to technology. Another thing that really affects the way people have a so-called game culture is the leisure gap, or the amount of free time that allows them to play enough games to eventually make some. This was harder to come by in a non-Western condition for a majority of the people, but the world is changing and accessibility to the tools of play with it. The most common methodology, I hope we have moved on to the next slide here.
I got you.
Thank you. The most common methodology is the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics model and other variations upon the same. Mechanics are actions one takes in a game. Dynamics are the effects of those actions, and aesthetics are the visibility or the skin of the game. While players appreciate a game's form first, also known as the aesthetics, designers start at the mechanics end of the spectrum. MDA as a format works so well only because the audience and designers come from the same cultural pool. Within reason, one can argue that game designers have traditionally been gamers, that is, emerging from the core cultural pool that both feeds and creates the final product, that is the game.
So the mechanics...
Ben's going to talk a little bit more about different methodologies of games. Oh, sorry, did you already start
I already
speaking?
got it. So the mechanics we have are a limited set of systems available to us after decades of use, decades of practice. This is how we sort of use and talk about games. And the use of play and game testing. And they're not a bad they're not a bad lens to use in game design. And most of the games that we enjoy and most of the games that we play, we've used a mechanics-based kind of MDA-esque, you can say, methodology to create them. And they create incredibly fun and engaging games. And they work, so to speak, as games do. The common theme here that we always focus on is like the mechanic and the feedback and the experience from this system. This is Dan Cook. He's a great, I really like him as a game designer. This is Jesse Schell. But what is missing from all of these beautiful, you don't have to read all this. This is sort of just an example that people have thought very deeply about this. And we're not trying to discredit anything they've done. But even with all these beautiful diagrams we have of like how we understand play and how we communicate about play, we're still missing one thing. And we're kind of missing like cultural understanding, and we're missing sort of like a cultural framing. And that is often assumed or forgotten because game designers simply haven't had to do that because most of, especially video game designers, because they've been mostly making video games for the same people in the same cultural pool that they're in.
And just to add to that, aesthetics are always sort of positioned at the bottom rung, a lot of times in the development process, because, as we mentioned before, they're called the skin of the games. In other words, they're a very superficial element of the game. However, the aesthetics is what most players relate to. And the aesthetics is where culture comes and sort of nests, so to speak. I would venture to maybe suggest a new definition of games that might be more along the lines of games as systems placed within a closed space of play. Closed because games are limited systems that are nested within larger social and cultural ecosystems. Fundamental to making games is our understanding of society, culture, and identity because they all form a part of the process of game making. We are making social terrariums here, microcosms that represent aspects of the larger systems we exist in. Games are intertwined within the culture of consumption around them. Because even if a game is a fictional system, it is only a potential system until a player activates it. So even if the game idea within its pristine logic and narrative are all fictional, the game object, so to speak, only comes into existence when it is being played with. A potential space becomes actualized into a tangible reality. The player is always grounded in the real world and as a result is inexorably connected with some form of culture.
And our game design is working, right? Like we're making fun games. We're not making unfun games. We're making way better games than we ever have. But every culture has their own food and art and way of making food and way of making art. And so, and also communication methods and social norms. So it follows that each culture also has their own patterns of play and patterns of games. And why not they should have their own ways of making games and ways of like games methodologies. And ignoring culture and assuming the manner in which your culture plays is the correct way to play will often turn people off of your game. And we go even a little bit farther. We feel that assuming that a culture will play the game that you play games in is actually a form of imperialism. Like if you assume that people eat the way that you eat, that's colonialism or imperialism. We've been there, but with games, we're not talking about this yet. So, sort of taken to the extreme, can we ever really make games for someone else we can, and so that's what we're sort of trying to talk about, how we can have frameworks for this.
Right, and just to go on that again, craft and content are two symbiotic parts of game design. They're both very necessary and they both have their own place within the larger system of games. While expertise in a craft is important and necessary, content or aesthetic is as important for the players as it allows them to engage with the system in an intuitive manner. It stands to reason that cultural intuition is learned through engaging with that culture. So aside from relocating to the area and immersing ourselves within that culture, the obvious solution to me seems to be to work with individuals from that area, preferably a cross-section representative of the diversity within that space as well. By preventing the, so to speak, other from participating in the creation of the game, we are creating a convenient hierarchy within the craft, backed up by a homogeneity of aesthetic culture.
And we all have known games are sort of have a normally Western-centric aesthetic, especially video games here we're mostly talking about, and take advantage of interaction, technological, and social languages that we don't realize that we have. And so I tend to call this usability entitlement. Designing games in this way, we sometimes inadvertently create games that distance players from the experience because we accidentally put our culture in the way. Because we're building games within our culture without assuming the culture in which the games are being played. So, and players often create culture as well. This isn't like a one-way. We're not trying to set up a false ontology or anything like that. But we need training at better making through games and culture. We need training to be better at making through, but through one's cultural bias doesn't necessarily make games and education training hopeless. We can still train ourselves to make games better. So, can games be designed without specific training or craft?
I think they can, but there's a way around it, right? With the demystification of tools and techniques of game design, the world has reclaimed video games, and by relation games in general, as an art form. Another aspect of the expansion of games as a medium is the appropriation of games by non-traditional groups, such as games for someone or something different, games by someone different. The answer here again is yes. We don't get the same games that we're used to making and seeing, but we get something new, and to me that's really exciting. The great caterwauling of the art games art debate did seal the fate of games in a sense. If games are art, then games can mean and be different things. A mass medium, so to speak. So if we place games in the context of the larger world of media and art, then it seems inevitable for the survival of the medium for it to adapt, change, and skills it. The disruption of the familiar and the safe systems of design is unavoidable. Not doing so would pigeonhole games into a tiny box hidden under an ocean of insignificance.
So we have a sort of a framework that we'd like to present as mindful play, and this is a framework for combating cultural bias in game design and game design methodologies. And we're not trying to replace any game design methodology. We feel like this could be applied if you like super formal game design methodologies, like if you want to do MDA or whatever. It's also something you could consider if you're trying to make games outside of the cultural bias that you have. And we're really aiming at play, because what's the point of games if you're not playing them? So the first one is forget your own play culture.
Right, because teaching people to play is both a colossal waste of time as well as dilutes your core message. The purpose of projects set in the real world is often to create awareness and or empathy in the target audience about a specific issue, not to introduce Western play culture to them. So what happens when we try and force-feed someone our kind of play culture is that our own style and manner of playing and by relation designing is defined by our own cultural upbringing. So this is okay, but if you take the play culture you're used to and take it to another culture, you're going to lose the people before you start, because your language, your objects of play are all probably really alien to them. Just think about it. What would the average American do with a rugby or a cricket ball? They'd probably play football or baseball, right?
Mm-hmm. They're not doing it wrong. So we only have a couple minutes left, so we're going to do the examples that we've done quickly so we can get to all 4 steps before the end. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Yeah, this is a workshop I facilitated in the Philippines where we co-designed games with the local staff to share information about climate change. So this is a bunch of really random games that came out of it that were a lot of fun and were completely not the way I would express climate change to anyone, but they worked really well and we had a lot of fun. So going on to point 2, use local or familiar game assets. right? This seems like a little bit of an obvious one, but it gets skipped a lot. As designers, we have ownership over things we design and make that are branded to look and feel like things we make. However, that's not always the best way to design something for people who may not be familiar with your aesthetic sensibilities. This is one of the most amazing games I've ever come across, and this also happened at one of the co-design sessions I had hosted last year. We had very little money and very few resources available to us, so the group made this crazy game about sort of supporting diverse forms of ecosystem building and awareness by tying ropes around each other's bellies and trying to collectively push a stick into a bottle together. This was a group of like 20 people. It was amazing. It blew my mind. So, okay, rushing on. Number two, it's oh sorry.
So
did I skip?
No. So
Right.
also just sort of
Right.
improvise pieces of game pieces with things with what's ever around. So we have 1 minute left. I'm just going to jump over that one. Right to number three, design for the conversation. So this is a super important concept we feel game designers are skipping sometimes. Not all of them, of course, but like when you are especially trying to create a game for a separate culture, you want to create a meaningful dialogue among the players because that will bring the game outside of your culture and put it into theirs. Once people start qualifying a game with cultural affect and cultural signifiers that they have, it's now a cultural object that they're holding and mutating and it's a mutable cultural object. Excuse me. So in LARPs, this is called froth. It's the talk that goes on in the game about the game, and also the talk that goes on after the game about the game. And sometimes we design games about driving safety, where people have to, as a mechanic in the game, talk to each other about the game, and if they don't do that very well, they crash cars. All right, number four. Serious games have a bad reputation for what I call on-the-nose design. And on-the-nose design is sort of like, this is a term borrowed from script writing, where an actor, to say they're angry is like, I am so angry, and they act like they're angry, and then they act, that's actually super condescending to actors because you're not trusting their acting craft. And if we do this in game design, if you make a recycling game about recycling, you get points for recycling, gamers know that. And they know that you're being condescending to them. People are smart, right? So if you make a game where they can sort of experience different aspects of the game within it, and let the players mess up, let the players fight. This is a game where we got a bunch of climate scientists to be slumlords and have floods and that sort of thing. So I'm gonna let Mohini do. So we're part of a changing ludic landscape, and then we'll lap up.
Right. As Ben has been saying in Araj, the world is changing around us, right? And it is natural that the old hierarchies and the exclusive privileges that existed with them are weakening. Games are changing and gamers are changing. The question remains is, can we change with them? Thank you very much. And sorry for all the technical problems.
And thank you for bearing with us. And we'd love to talk to you more. We'll probably put Mohini up on a video so we can do a little question and answer after this. We'll move on.
Great. Thank you, Ben and Mohini. And up next we have Pierre Depaz.
How much time did we actually have? 15. Oh, we thought we had 20. Does that not emailed or something? Or sorry. Okay.
All right, so I'm Pierre. I'm a second-year student here at the Game Center. I come from a background of political science, and I'm going to talk today about how we can embed a particular kind of political theory, which is the philosophy of the alignment, into our games to sort of have grasp a better concept of what is our Western culture. The way we do that is through first the scientific concept of simulation. So we can all sort of agree that games are more or less a kind of simulation, but as we develop games, simulations have also developed on their own as a scientific tool that people use, and they're understanding problems in a novel way that go just beyond mathematical formulas. So let's look first at a subset of scientific simulation, which is the agent-based models, and what are they applied to, and what is the methodology that they're using, and that we can use as game designers. So basically, it's not agent-based models don't provide a solution; they provide a new way to look at a problem. You start with your assumptions with your agents, and then you start with the interaction between these agents, and you use the computing power of computers to have emergent results, and then interpret these results. To give you a quick overview of how they're used today, there's some research on sociology. So, for example, Leonard Epstein is using it to model civil violence in the wake of the Arab Spring. Lars Erik Siderman is using it in international relationships, international relations, to analyze the formation and the dissolution of nation-states in the post-Cold War Eastern Europe. And it was even used when epidemiologist researchers analyzed the corrupted blood incident in World of Warcraft to see how people would react to the eruption of an epidemic. What I think is interesting about agent-based models is that they allow you to carry on with the thought process, with starting with your assumptions and ending up with a result, and that's something that humans can do, right? Because sometimes you just miss certain steps between the original facts and what you consider being the emerged result, or you're just not able to imagine what is the emerged result in general, or you're not able to figure out how the emerged result would change if you just slightly change your basic assumptions. So if we use it as input, we can see that using the scientific concept of simulation makes you think about what it is you want to think about. You can talk about democracy, but once you have to write about democracy in your code when you're running your simulation, then you actually you're using terms that are defined very precisely. So if you say a system of government, what is government? And you're going to look into Webster, and Webster's going to tell you government, blah, 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 and it's still very elusive. But if you're using, okay, this is decision power equals 1, 1 is your integer, public has a very particular definition this is a Java code. But all of these terms have very particular definitions that you can look up, and you can say, okay, this I'm okay with it, I'm not okay with it. If you're not okay with it, then you're going to use a different language. But you have a very granular analysis of what you're trying to say in your simulation. And as an output, this simulation is also super useful because it allows the rigorous exploration of the tester's assumption, which means that we externalize the thought process. We leave all the big computing load to the computer, and we look at the results themselves. These are assumptions. We're coding them, and then this is our result, and what does the result say about our assumptions themselves? When we apply those to the politic of the alignments, I want to talk about this particular kind of politics, because I think that today a lot of people don't like politics because they confuse politics and politicians, and I think that the politics of the alignment are, so they're these politics that were developed between the 17th and the 18th century, and they're contemporary to the development of our modern democracies. So the ideas that these people had 2 or 3 are still present in our societies, and they're still a way to understand how we live together. So let's just take a look at what they thought about. The main point of the politics of the alignment is what they call social contract theory. And social contract theory tries to understand this one question, which is, how is it that we manage to live together? And is this the best way that we can all live together? This is an example. This is a book, an essay by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, The Discourse on the Origin and Basis of the Inequality Among Men, and that was the beginning of what provided the theoretical framework for the French Revolution, which then provided the theoretical framework for the Declaration of Rights of the UN. And this whole system that we live in as a Western civilization is based on what these people have thought. For example, John Locke was also a big influence on the drafting of the Declaration of Independence in the US. So when you start thinking about what they thought about and using computer simulations to have a different perspective on it, then you can go beyond what they did, because what they did was just thought experiments, right? they spend their whole lives thinking about something and thinking very rigorously about what it implies if man is inherently good or inherently bad, and they thought about what does that imply, what does that imply, what is the greatest structure that emerged from that. So they started with assumptions about individuals, and they derived laws, and they were trying to reach optimum. So like, what is the best way for us to live together? At this point, I just want to take a side note, because when you replace these two words, you have your assumptions about players, and you derive rules to reach goals. And this is just a point to reassess the fact that game design is highly political. Whenever you create a system, whenever you create your rules, that means you have assumptions about your players, and you want them to reach particular goals, right? You're imposing, if you think that our present political institutions have a particular kind of moral view that they want to impose on us, then what you're doing as a game designer is also imposing your moral view onto your players. So using this simulation is going to make us understand better what are our assumptions and how do we present them to our players. This is one of the most important part of the politics of the alignment, the state of nature, which is how was man before we came into civilized society? How did we exist before we existed as a part of a community, right? And that applies very well to an agent-based simulation. You start with an individual characteristic because everyone is a repository of this assumption, and the answer is linked to the outcome. Like only by our interaction can we have an answer as to what was life before our modern lives. And it's unverifiable without the computing power. So we could just do it with scientific model, right? We could just follow the guidelines that academia or research universities have and try and publish a paper on that. But as game designers, we also have the freedom of using it in an artistic way. So we have more freedom in terms of what we want to say, what we want to input, and what is the overall outcome that we're going to present to our player to interact with. So the transition from scientific to artistic, it allows for more freedom, but if you consider game design as art, I think that good art is still understandable art. And it's the task of the designer as an artist to provide an understandable experience. And that's not to say catering to the lowest common denominator, but presenting ideas and concepts that can be grasped by anyone, with the only requirement being that on the player's side being at least goodwill and thoughtfulness. So if you expect that from a player, which I think everybody is, then you can start having a conversation about what you're presenting to them as a process-based simulation. Let's look at how we can artistically, which is unscientifically, represent a given set of human behaviors in a game and their consequences on both the process of designing and the result that is presented to the players. The state of nature, so this is this idea of what life was before civil societies came to be. Wealth seeking is, in other words, what is our drive to own things? What is our relationship to the non-humans? How do we represent that in games? And how do we let players interact with that? And then this vague thing that is culture, that people which is omnipresent and that we still don't think in granular enough terms to make it a statement in itself. So the first part of this, using these scientific tools, is that you have to break down your ideas, right? You have this very loosely defined concept, which is what is a human, what was a human before civilization, and you put it into this hyper-rigid framework, and this tension yields interesting results. So if you use object-oriented programming, you create a new class, and that's your agent. But then what do you pass to your agent? Do you only pass variables that are useful for game design, or do you pass variables that are also representing something meaningful about your assumptions of what is a human in your game? So it could be that they need a position, right? You need to be somewhere on the screen, but they also need a shape. And then you start asking the question: what is the shape? Do they all start with the same shape? Are they all different, or are they all the same? Do they inherently have the same aspect and the same size, or do they vary over time, starting the same at the beginning? Do they start different? These are all political questions, as they're in themselves forcing the designer to take a stance on a political issue. This is a choice that can be made in a game design point of view, but it's also a choice that can be made in a political point of view. I don't think that these two are mutually exclusive. The thing is that designing something as fun as possible usually requires a lot of effort, and designing something political also requires a lot of effort. So you end up having a supplementary level of effort that is required in your design process, but I think it's worth it. you can see also in terms of wealth seeking, how do you define that? How do you define the relationship to the non-human in your game? Because most games imply that people have resources and you take resources and you do stuff with resources. And that's highly, highly political. Adam Smith started thinking about economy in terms of this is what our world will look like, and economy has become the most important thought framework in our world. And just this difference in when you start modeling your game, what does that mean? Does that mean that when the agent comes upon a resource, is the agent acting upon the resource, or is the resource acting upon the agent? And just this different line of code, which ultimately might not make a huge difference to your eyes, actually means something very important of presenting your thought as an ecological thought or as a phenomenological thought. There's a huge amount of literature in terms of software studies, but I think that this kind of interaction, this kind of thinking about game design is one of the most important ones. There's a really interesting paper about the AI of The Sims 3 that's really well titled. It's called Dumb People, Smart Objects, and the way it works is that the Sims don't actually think, the objects do the thinking for them. So the objects broadcast messages of, oh, I am a bathroom and you need to relieve your bladder, come to me, or oh, I'm a couch and you're very tired, come to me. And that gives a statement about the designers that were thinking the most important thing in the game are the objects, is the consumerism. And it's something that's embedded very deeply in that also in the end shapes the interaction of the players with your system. The thing that's a little bit frowned upon in the scientific community is faking data, right? Like you want to have the most pure numbers to start with as possible. But when you think about faking data as variable tweaking, that's something we do all the time as game designers. And defining the very range of what the player can interact with is, again, a statement in itself. It's for example, if you're simulating a group of agents that develop culture over time, and you say that culture is like, oh, the difference between, you have one number, it's between the difference between 0 and 10. If you have a culture of 0, you're different than the person that has a culture of 10. But then, what is the range of these variables that you're allowing the player to play with, right? Is it going to be an integer? Is it going to be a float? Or are you going to increment culture in discrete steps or in continuous steps? It might be easier for you as a designer to play with integers because it's easy, it's more interesting, it's more clear to the player. But does that accurately represent what the culture of someone is? Are you moving from 0 to 1 and there's nothing between 0 and 1? And what would be the difference between someone with a culture of 0 and someone with a culture of 1, and then someone with a culture of 0 and someone with a culture of 10? How do you represent that? Is it just like counting the difference mathematically, or is there something more to it? And how do you code this more? And once you've made that choice, what output do you get from the simulation? How can you as the designer interpret the result, and how can your player interpret this? And this is where we can leave from the basic part of simulation, and you can actually use other tools to enrich your games. And that's the last thing that I want to talk about before jumping to conclusions. Because if we think that all the tools are political, then not just simulations. One of the most important things is also the story in the spoken word, right? We've talked a little bit about how using words can be very loose and very unreliable, but it's also a great possibility. It's also a great possibility to provide a different perspective on another problem. You already have your simulation, and if there's no way to convey a truth through only one mean, right? So you're using this simulation, and you have this systematic and maybe visual rhetoric, but you can always provide other ways to think about it at the same time. That's the beauty of having interactive systems that regroup different part of both the arts and the engineering fields. And so as a conclusion, I'd like just to put the accent on the fact that by exploring our own assumptions regarding political matters, we can shift the focus of that exploration from the consequences computed for us by the machine to what it actually means to define these assumptions in the first place, and to allow players to interact with them. And then once we know that, we can also learn how to subvert the tool to use it to express ideas. What are the limitations and what are the constraints of these tools, and how can I use these limitations and how can I use these constraints to provide a message that's meaningful regarding everything that constitutes me as a person and everything that constitutes my statement that is being re-examined very closely. And finally, just not limit ourselves to one particular tool for politics and encompass all aspects of our lives, be it systematic or visual or written, and just in general broaden our horizons. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. Next up, we have Yifat Shaik. Thank you very much.
Just set stuff up. Ooh, even mirrored. Great. Don't have to do anything. Yay. Hello. I have to say in advance, this is the worst, key point presentation I've ever done. I'm usually really proud of my key point presentation. I work very hard on them, but unfortunately, life as it is, it's been kind of rough to work about it. So my name is Yifat. I'm a game designer / illustrator / few other stuff. I do a lot of technical art. I also teach in OCAD University in Toronto, and I'm a member of Danes Making Games. I was also briefly part of my life an activist in Israel and Palestine. I'm Israeli. And I also like to laugh. And my talk is about how you don't have to be serious to be serious. And a lot of it came from the fact that there's not a lot of funny games out there. There's been the early Sierra games and LucasArts that had parody elements to them. There have been some really badly crude bro humor kind of games. Sorry about my not so nice terms, and there has been a few games recently who've sort of been subverting game mechanics, like Goat Simulator, which I love, but it doesn't have a particular political message, but it certainly use humor for subversing to subvert stuff. But my question is, where is the Monty Python of games? Where is the Mel Brooks of games? Where is, I don't know, countless other? Where is the Dave Chappelle? Where is all those great subversive, humoristic, pop culture icons that created a really, really strong and serious message in their movies or comedy or whatever, but were still funny? And if anyone ever seen the original producer, it's probably one of the most subversive thing you're ever gonna see. It's an amazing movie. So yeah, we're funny games. I think this is from the 19th century. Caricature, obviously. So Terry Pratchett, who recently passed away, unfortunately, and Neil Gaiman wrote a very nice, a very evocative piece about how Terry Pratchett was actually really angry, and he just used humor to show how freaking angry it is. And so the quote is about how, I won't read it because I don't have time, but how his fury was the engine that created this world. This world is a very good example of using subversive humor and using humor to say stuff about humanity and the human race. So there's a few, it's a huge subject, and there's been a few, I wanted to take it, I was contemplating how to talk about it, and I decided that's probably the best way to talk about it. Instead of going, oh, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jewish humor, and then and so quote-unquote ethnic humor, as the few academic papers about it wrote. It's a horrible term, I'm sorry. But I wanted to go out of North America. And part of it is because I'm not North American, and I have huge critique about, as a Jew, about the current stage of Jewish humor and how it's very oppressive to Jews who were not Ashkenazi North American. I'm half Iraqi Jew, so it's a whole other issue. But so I decided to go to what I love, which is activism, and how activists use humor. And so, before I'll talk about activism, there's a few theories of humor. I'm not going to talk a lot about them, but there's a certain agreement that there's 3 different theories of humor and how people use humor. The first one is I can't speak today, I'm sorry. And this says basically you make fun of people, right? And this is like if someone is awkward and doesn't fit, you make fun of him. And it's used for correcting abnormal social behavior. So if you're different and people make fun of you, so you'll act like everybody else. So it's not the kind of humor we want to use. Relief theories, for me, it's probably the more interesting one. And it believes that humor can heal. And by using this humor, and especially like if you're a minority in a country and using subversive humor, it gives you a sense of relief. And it's a temporary relief, but it helps you deal with a certain issue. And this word that I tried for an hour to say, but I can't say. So the incongruity.
Yeah.
There's a few words in English that are horrible. It took me months to manage to say subversive. So this belief that if you take, the theory is built on taking opposite ideas and mashing them together and creating a sort of dissonance and this creates your humor. So, for example, wheat or puns is taking 2 words that don't matter and mashing them together to create something new. So why is humor a powerful anti-oppression tool? So I'll probably send a link video, and it was a video, a TED talk of one of the activists from Serbia during the revolution in Serbia, and he talked about how they used humor. And the reason why humor melts, and the reason why it's a good tool, it melts fear. So if you're making fun of the people in power, you're losing the fear of that person. You're no longer afraid of him. It's approachable. So we all laugh, and we enjoy laughing. And you can put a hell of a lot more in funny than you would in non-funny stuff. You can say a lot more, and it can be a lot stronger, but people will react better to that. It creates a dilemma for the opponent. So that's an interesting thing in activism, especially if you're making fun of the person in power. He can't answer you back, because if he answers you back, it's like paying attention to you, and if he doesn't answer you back, it's gonna look ridiculous. It's gonna look ridiculous anyway. So you create a dilemma whether to answer for the opponent, whether to answer or not, and most opponent will decide yes, and then will be almost more ridiculous than you were before. So it heals, again, it provides a sense of relief, and it gives you power. So human activism. So activists use humor in the work to express contradiction and hypocrisy in their societies, build electoral, economic, and cultural power, and ultimately undermine the dominance of corrupt and oppressive institution and elite. Humor helps preserve sanity in the midst of a chaotic or corrupt socio-political environment. Furthermore, by eliciting laughter, humor can frame human rights issues in a more emotional and human context. Activist humor generally stems from the underdog. Humor can frame human rights issue in a more emotional and give it a human context. Attempt to exploit their social, political, and economic and racial privileges in the expense of the wider population. Human rights activists support their movement by employing strategy as creating irony, discrediting hate, group to divert attention from the agenda, and using pop culture, choreography, hoaxes, and parodies. While some organize radical hate speech to minimize its effect, others create hoaxes to gain mass media attention that can expose institutional bias to a wide audience of views. Social media nowadays also have powered that. Political satire and social commentary have become widespread on the internet, especially in countries where dissident and criticism of the government has hard consequences. Russian, I will talk a little bit about Egypt. Russians, for example, use comics, cartoon, puppets, and street art to connect problems to responses to the authority. In applying humorous tactics, participants emphasize the importance of creativity, internationally, courage and commitment, and of course the success of a joke. Exploiting the ridicule is about playing on the absurdity of institutional power through the skillful remixing of popular culture. It explores how activists are experimenting and challenging and reframing what it means to be political through some of the sharper tools in the activist toolkit: humor, irony, satire, parody, and etc. So there's a lot of examples, and I chose especially non-violent activism. Some research done on activists in general shows that what's called non-violent activism tends to be has a greater chance of success than violent activism. Whether it's true, I don't know, but that's the current research. I think it was 22% more, and it also has a better strength to engage people who are not from that particular community. So the first, this is from, I think, like social worker in England, fighting for their rights. So the Arab Spring, we all know, but one of the interesting things about the Arab Spring was how they used ridiculing Mubarak and his regime, whether it was by cartooning. This is all kinds of like saying, they use Twitter, stuff like that, to make fun of Mubarak and his regime, and ridiculing to the point where he couldn't answer them in a way that wouldn't make him ridiculous himself. It was an integral part of the 2011 Egyptian revolution machinery, which created political climate that publicized the dissident that until then had been a private matter for Egyptian people. Their use of humor spread to the internet and spread to activists all over the world, and created a sort of awareness of what's been happening in Egypt. And this is where I'm gonna, like, as an Israeli, I was like really excited and retweeting until I was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't do it because I'm Israeli. A little bit about, I'll talk a bit about Tahrir Square, and from there it spread to and the international audience that responded to what was happening, and the humor that was used by the Egyptian people was no longer just had the audience of the Egyptian people, but rather international, diverse, and geographically widespread audience. The use of the new venue of communication and social media, especially Twitter, in addition to protest posters and banners, coupled with seriousness and persistence of the protesters' demands, were all reasons behind the shift of humor and style that did not allow for a long narrative joke. One of the things they had was like everyday stuff change. Every day they had new stuff. Every day they had new caricature. Every day they had new funny songs or lyric. It was a big while obviously it wasn't the reason why it fell, it was a very big part of their activism. I have to see if I have. It involved witty one-liners and visual humor. Some posters equated Mubarak to a pirate, to the devil, a donkey, which is a huge insult, with some other equating to trash that needed to be taken out. Several posters commented on his dim wit, and almost all of them asked him to leave Egypt. As one political cartoonist commented, it no longer had to resort to masking the subject of the humor, but changing the appearance. It can now openly ridicule Mubarak. As far as surveys that were conducted showed that people were using social media to circulate jokes about Mubarak regime almost as much as they were using to provide logistic information about the protests. Although humor cannot directly change laws or physically prevent human rights issues, it can contribute to the movement, serve as a political act, and confront and change problematic attitudes and prejudice. Satire and humor and activism can promote resistance, express taboo or controversial opinion, and all the advantage over cooperation with politicians. One participant in Egypt demonstration referred to the satire as shapeshifters for their ability to deliver shocking materials and adopt persona that highlight the absurd reality of injustice and corrupt institutions in Egypt. The internet allowed humorous tactics to flourish, as anonymity online allowed more freedom to test and limit, changing authority and circulate material to limit its number of people. Meanwhile, the cooperation and political targeted by humor and activism usually cannot engage in satirical discourse or defend itself, especially in the internet, due to the professional image, as one participant said, you can't win an argument against the joker. The other actor, a more Western one, is the clown army, better known as the clandestine insurgent rebel clown army. Okay, I'll do it really quick. You can read their thing online. They started in the UK. They're all over. This one, they're Israeli. It's in Nabi Salah, which is a Palestinian village. This is also in Israel. This is border police. And they use ridicule and clowning to create for the creation of they use clowning for protests. They learn how to clown. They use it's a big part of the tactic. So I don't have time, so I can't talk too much about it. But because I have more important stuff. So humor can become oppressive. So this is probably the most important thing. As wonderful of a tool it is, it really easily can be oppressive. So the reason why is because people tend to fall to certain stuff. So in order to avoid being oppressed, and as I said, there's a lot of humor that easily becomes oppressed. I said as you know, if you see another joke about a Jew and he's white and lives in his mother's basement, that's oppressive. So in order to avoid respect the people you're also making fun of. If you're making fun of a religion especially, know a bit about it. Privilege, now you're privileged. Let the people without power be the voice, not you. Awareness, be aware of the issue, be aware of the social connotation, be aware of the social, if you're protesting or something happening in another country, be aware exactly of the social, how everything works there. Stereotype, avoid stereotype. Once you start stereotyping, you're lost. And yeah, please make fun games.
All right, so we have about 20 minutes for Q&A. If all the panelists would please pull up the chair and come up here. And if we could get Mohini back on.
So what tends to happen, I think this is loud enough, so most people will hear. What tends to happen if we put Mohini here is that it looks like Big Brother. But if we can't hear her, we can put her up there and that sort of thing. Let's put it on the screen. Yeah. You put it on the screen? Okay, let's do it.
Cool.
We could,
If
if
you
you want her
down
human
for a
size, just put her on that pedestal.
Oh, and then run the sound? That makes sense, yeah.
Okay, or Big Brother.
Big Brother? Okay.
Whatever. Operating as not.
If everyone's okay with that. Does anybody have any questions? Y'all didn't while I get set up so it's not as awkward.
Questions to start?
Yes. I had a question for Ben and Mohini
Yes.
specifically. You're talking a lot, you kind of talked a lot about the means of producing games being spread more to different cultures and different regions.
Mm-hmm.
And you touched very briefly on different design methodologies.
Right.
But I was wondering if in the places where you're seeing new games being made, if you're seeing different design methodologies kind of come up. Because like there's a certain, I would say, pretty prominent design philosophy in North America, at least, that's very like playtest centric, very player focused, and I think that is obviously a political act. If you're designing in a certain way, then that's political, right? I think that's a big part of this whole panel. So I'm just wondering if there's any different type of design methodologies that are coming out of different regions that are making games that you know.
So, did you hear the question?
Yeah, hopefully it does.
So,
Yeah, I did. Do you want to take it?
So, we don't know yet.
Okay.
We've been working on this mindful play stuff for the last year or so, and we realized that as part of like trying to create games for other cultures that we were doing it wrong. It's like we had this sort of aha moment if you saw different games a couple of years ago, like where we were trying to make Muslims in Indonesia use dice, and they were like, no, that's gambling, and that's that's horrible. And so in the process of that, we're like, how do we make games for these people? And then saying that, we realized that's actually problematic. Why don't we give them the tools to make games? It's like, well, why do we have all the tools to make games? So we see sort of this step back, and then it became, I don't know. So I would love to look at some of those and like look at how people have developed other methodologies, other game making methodologies. And I also love to have like a methodology jam, because how do game makers solve problems? We have game jams, right? So I don't know if Mohini wants to say anything to this too.
Yes, I do. I'm just going to jump in there and say that. So I've been in India for the last year or so, and we do have the game industry here. It's really young. And I have been thinking about the question you just asked, actually. Are there different ways by which people approach professional game design? And I think the simple answer to that is that globally, like indigenous game industries are a very new thing, especially in a commercial environment. I mean, there's a lot of smaller studios looking to express a kind of cultural narrative using games that perhaps try more interesting things. But in a professional space, I think aspiration is where it's at for a lot of especially Asian game devs. So what happens is, if aspiration is the goal, then you try to emulate the format that's working better. So as a result of it, what I normally see is that best practices are copied from the West into the East right now, and I think till the point where there's a saturation like a global saturation of indigenous games, we aren't really going to see any specific methodologies appear from region to region yet. So Ben is right in saying that it's too early to tell right now, and what happens is people just copy what works and what makes money, and money is really the driving force for most industries everywhere. Indie scenes are extremely small. And even the small indie scenes mostly try and get into the casual gaming scene, if at all. So the sort of game environment or the game ecosystem we have in the States perhaps is, I won't call it unique, but it's definitely not very common. So I think we should keep looking at how Asia perhaps, well, because I'm in Asia, I'm like focusing on it, but how Asia is making games and how the industry is expanding.
And we've yelled at a good friend of ours about how he's like, well, he went over and consulted a Chinese company. He's like, yeah, they just didn't do games right. And we're like, they're Chinese. They're doing games for Chinese. You know, like you can't just say that. Sorry.
Yeah, but I was going to say that you know, in a post or in a colonial or post-colonial globalized world, a lot of Western practices have infiltrated, methodologies have infiltrated, you know, various different countries, continents, and that's going to impact the methodology. I'm a nonprofit. I spent like 3 months of the year in India and have for the last decade, and I work in rural India, and I see both methodology and even narratives, and there's definitely different narratives, but like the kids that we work with will write their fiction as if they were white people. Like they will actually write their characters as white as they identify themselves in that narrative because they've been so indoctrinated through both colonialism and globalization to think in a very Western perspective.
Yeah.
So how do you create games that don't have this like saturation of Western influence, even in rural India, where I'm working in? It's interesting. Like the methodology and narratives are very heavily swayed in one direction.
I mean, part of the problem is that we have a centralized education system and all textbooks come in mostly from there. And I know there's like different types of boards of education and stuff, but a bunch of the kind of literature and sort of the texts that you go through are very British.
Yeah, the CBSE
to the
and
point
ISE.
that I identify more with like British pop culture that I haven't even seen than American, just because it's just like the thing that I know more of. So I think you're right in saying that there is this sort of colonial influence that's still there. It's very, very visibly still there. But I think the only way out of it is saturating enough, right? Like till a point where there's a point of crisis and then the influence can't hold anymore. I think it's also very, it's helpful to copy when you're not confident. I know it is for me, and I think I see that a lot around as well, that copying allows you to have a bar that's accessible in terms of assessing your like skill and stuff. So I think for me personally, I think give it another 5 years, and I think then we can actually see the industry kind of catching hold. And I say industry because I think industry will lead to more aspirational like developers coming out of the scene. Like there are a few Indian game devs who have been doing some really interesting, really strange kind of narratives that deal with not just Indian cultural stories, but also just like really random like quiet content and stuff. And I think that's the kind of thing I'm really interested in seeing, because we don't really live in medieval India anymore. So we're living in a world that has a kind of global mass media influence. So what comes out of modern India is what I'm really interested in seeing. Or like any other country, honestly, that's not the best. I don't know if that addressed your question actually.
Important. I mean, it's fairly complex.
Yeah. Don't want to take up all the floors. So.
I had a question about humor. I work building like algorithms and software that we really, really hope would be seen as independent, like on their own and separate. And it actually kind of relates to a couple of other talks as well, I guess. If you were to come across a piece of software that you were told was independently created, like on its own, autonomous, whose privilege or cultural background do you think it's acceptable to play with? Do you think it basically inherits from the program? If that's the way I've gone, I feel like that's the safest way to go. But I wondered if you had any other feelings about that for either of any of the topics that I mentioned.
What do you mean by independent software? So written by one person?
They often are written by one person, but occasionally they are written by groups of people of different backgrounds. And it becomes quite complex. I don't know if you kind of just take the ceiling of their backgrounds or...
Well, I guess the first part is obviously how you've written it, so it's the person that has written it, and then you sort of walk back up towards what are the tools that you're using, because you're using some sort of language or library to write it, and this has been written by someone else, and then it runs on a particular hardware, and this has been built by someone else, and all this hardware has been functions because of specifications and norms that someone else has written. So I guess my point is that there's no such thing as independent software, but that you have the most obvious point of entry is what does the programmer think, and then the influence sort of dims down. It's still there, but it dims down as you go back up as to what is the so it isn't as an inverse pyramid, I guess.
So you think you'll never be able to cut the cord, kind of? It will always be, yeah.
But as long as you're aware of it,
Yeah.
things that way.
I have sort of a question in general, because there's a lot of, I feel like user-centric design models have built into them sort of an inherent, let's see, like it's like a French term, like the beautiful native, like the wise, like the old wise man in a village. Sorry, the noble savage. Thank you.
Yeah.
Like a lot of user-centric design models have like the noble savage idea built into them,
So does activism.
and activism as well. It's like, well, let's let rural children in India write stories, and then they write stories that are actually racist, right? And it's like, what do you do at that point? And like, how do you get around that? I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit with your
I
activism.
can probably talk about it for hours. I cited a lot when I was. I don't want to like read about white activists because it's not fair. Because some of them are great. But I saw it a lot in like political action in Israel and Palestine, and part of it had to do with how long it's been going on, where the Palestinians were treated as noble savages a lot. And I met Palestinians. First of all, they're quite educated. They're just as educated as the Israelis. And they're smart and they know what they want. And some of them are nice, some of them are not so nice. It's a natural thing. And it's the same with Israelis. And I saw it in activism a lot. I can give specific cases with certain activists who are problematic activists, who the Palestinians said we don't want to work with, and the response from certain activists was, well, we don't care, we want to work with this person. So it happens. I think having, when I talk about humor, but in general, like being aware, letting the voice of the people you're fighting for be the first thing that is heard, not your voice. It's one, and one of the things when I was looking for cartoons from Egypt is that when you look for pictures and you look at Egyptian cartoons from the revolution, all you find are American cartoons. It's really bad. And since I don't speak Arabic, it's really hard to find. Knowing class system is really useful when you're doing an activism, especially if you're an activist from another country or from another culture. Again, I'll draw from the Israeli-Palestinian. There is a very complicated class system in both societies, and being aware of how it works really helps you as an activist. But it's hard to avoid noble savage. I think an education for activists saying, and as an activist, educating yourself and learning your own stereotype that exists about certain people, even people you meant well and you meant to help, is really useful. There's no there's not an actual way to deal with this. If people are activists treating people as a noble savage or any other stuff, they should not be activists.
Yeah, and I think the situation is getting more and more complex with citizen activism kind of really making these days. I see this a lot because class is also. Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yeah. Just there was a picture problem.
Okay. So class is a huge problem, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a problem everywhere. It's a problem in the West and it's a problem in the East. And I see a lot of this in kind of casual activism where people will kind of sort of noble savage the other, right? Like their other, who's usually someone across a class distinction. And that's a really tough one because guilt often makes you go to the other extreme. So instead of being racist, you become like, you kind of glorify and pedestalize the other. And like neither of those two places are really healthy. And it gets even more complex when it's being done by the people for another part of their own people. So I think it's kind of unavoidable at some point, but it is something that people need to be really careful about and try to like unpack at their own pace. I don't know, that's what I do.
Yeah. I think also in relation to what the humor stuff, stereotyping is the worst thing you can do. And to the point, I think what made him really kind of giggle, it was like a thing, and they went well, but they presented the Palestinians all brown and the Israelis all white, blonde eye, and it's not true in either cases. And it lost all effectiveness of what it was supposed to be, because you have an Ethiopian Jew show up, or you have a blonde, blue-eyed Palestinian. There's plenty of those, and their struggle is just as legitimate as brown Palestinians. So that's a problem. Stereotyping. I found a big problem was people tend, when they criticize certain stuff, to have like the usual imagery, which is Nazi imagery, and put in a pig. So, but the problem with if you put a pig is if you're criticizing specific religions, specifically Judaism and Islam, that's a really, really huge problem, because you're insulting a big part of that population that might actually have solidarity with you, but you're telling them, you're putting their religious symbol next to a symbol that is extremely offensive to them. Same with Nazi imagery. Don't use Nazi imagery. It's also been effective since the 70s, I think. So that's my 2 cents.
We have time for one more question.
I have a question about simulation. So I really like your discussion of numerical representation of culture and how that's difficult. And I remember people like Ted Friedman, or also Adam Curtis, the filmmaker, sort of criticized the belief that world or society can be simulated, and they sort of posit that it's sort of a very political act, just simulating something numerically in a very specific kind of language and very specific system of representation. So I was wondering what you would say to that.
Well, I think they're critical about it because they would assume that simulations imply simulating everything. And once you start working on simulations, particularly on games, then you're only representing aspects of your world. And so you first have to choose what is it you want to simulate, and then you're working with some tools. And there's all these numbers and these representations of numbers in programming languages. You have the reference for that, so you know exactly what they mean and what they were intended for, and you can then use them as you would expect. So, if, for example, if you're not satisfied with, let's say, an array of numbers that represents different sorts of culture, and you think that maybe it's more than that, and you have like 2-dimensional arrays, 3-dimensional arrays, and so you have, I think, there's a lot of limitations, but these limitations are a good thing in the sense that they force you to work around, because everybody sort of understands what culture is, and everybody has an opinion as to what culture is. And once you start putting them down in like these black and white little signs on your computer screen, it forces you to think very thoroughly about what it is. And so no, you're not going to represent culture as the broadest thing in the world, because one, it's not, and everybody has different opinions of culture, so it would just be pretentious to think that you can just represent it. So when you start if you're okay with the fact that you're representing your own culture, then you're representing an aspect or an idea of it, and you don't need to be as truthful and objective and global as that.
And there's a real danger in like data visualization and I think simulation as well, because those are political things and we don't see them because they look pseudoscientific, which I think is a lot of what you were talking about as well. Like it's just so.
Because the danger of science is also assuming that this is the truth, right? That the conclusion you're reaching is something that is true for everyone and that everyone should embrace. But when you start accepting that this is not a scientific research but an artist statement, then you start giving the freedom of interpretation to your players. And so this is what you were saying about the discussion of playing games. There's an interpretation of the system you're presented with, and this discussion is actually the most enriching part, right? It just provides a framework for thinking about things rather than just giving a conclusion right away.
All right, great. Thank you guys. This was an amazing panel. It's my understanding there are now more refreshments out, so help yourselves. And then the next set of panels starts in 15 minutes.
Thank you. Where you work? I'm in the Tamil Nadu region. Yeah, I work in an organization called Something of an Insurance Project. We've been around for 18 years. We do a lot of things: healthcare, women's empowerment. We run the largest journalism school in India. But we're most famous for the documentary film that's out right now called Class. It's a boarding school for primarily developed backgrounds, extreme poverty. We give them an education from the age of 3.5, 4 years old until they graduate from high school.
So you have a second one?
And we pay for their college degree too.
Because I said, as you before, you were like, no, I had one today.
Highly successful careers, but it's a lot of work. And we've been doing it for a while. Yeah.